The first thing you're going to do is listen to the noise and see if your noise matches what we had on this Ford Explorer. Now, if your noise matches what you just heard in that video, pop both the tie rods out, zip the nuts off on each side, pop the tie rods out, and turn the wheel back and forth. And if you can still hear that grinding noise, you be confident it's coming from the steering gear itself. Now, these nuts a lot of times like to come off hard, so sometimes if you support the underneath of the tie rod, either put a jack underneath it or squeeze it with a channel lock, you'll then be able to heat this nut and zip it off without damaging the tie rod. Once you have confirmed it is the steering gear causing the noise, before you go to replace the steering gear, it's pretty important to do a couple of preparations before we start disassembling. First off, once you've got your tie rods popped loose, it's very important to get the steering wheel locked down. It does not have a lock, an ignition lock like you'd see on some older ones. They do make a tool to support the steering wheel to the seat, but if you don't have one, as you can see, I used a couple of tie straps and gently secured them so this steering wheel isn't going to be able to spin. We do that so that the steering wheel doesn't damage the clock spring when the rack is removed. The other thing that needs to be done is if you're going to do this on the ground, if you don't have a lift and you need to do this on the ground, we need to get a good support with the jacks that we're going to use a little bit further back than what we normally would. Now, the nice thing about these model years is you'll find there's a steel brace welded to the underframe on both sides where you can put your jack stands underneath to get the vehicle up in the air, and then you'll be using a jack on the ground to support the subframe, as we'll see shortly. If you have a lift and you're going to be doing this up in the air, you're going to need a tranny jack to help support the subframe as you lower it down. Now, you should already have the tie rods loose on both sides. Leave them out. You will also need to get the stabilizer link removed from the top of the strut. You don't need to pull the bottom loose unless you're replacing them, which may be a good idea up front to have new ones, because it is possible you're going to have to heat this nut in order to get it to break loose. And if you have to heat the nut, the chances of the stabilizer link surviving are pretty slim. Okay, so again, zip the nuts off, get both stabilizer links loose. You'll notice on both sides there is a part of the wheel well attached to the subframe where we just need to pull out the two push pins on each side. It's not difficult to remove. Just pop those out so that when we lower the subframe, we don't damage the wheel well. Now, the white pipe that goes to each catalytic converter does not need to be completely removed, but it needs to be lowered and pushed out of the way. One thing to note, they're both very easily accessible, both in the back and in the front. These nuts are very easily accessible, but if you do not heat the nut before you take it off, your chances of stripping it or actually breaking the stud are really good. So I would highly recommend take the time it takes, put some heat on that nut, get it glowing red, and then you'll be able to zip them off. And as you can see, it won't require you to replace studs afterwards. The next thing we're going to want to do is get the front cradle bolts loose on each side. Now, what I did is just put my impact, electric impact on here. I took one, zipped it loose, and then spun it up enough so there was about a 1/2 inch to a 3/4 of an inch gap on both bolts. Okay, once I get them both at that position, it'll leave enough room for the subframe to hang down when we're ready to lower the back of the subframe to remove the steering gear. Next, we'll want to remove this engine mount. Now, it's pretty simple to access. Zip these two bolts out, and then I put the bolts back in once it was hanging down so I didn't have to go looking for them later. Now, before we start lowering the subframe down, we are going to need to get the steering gear loose from the steering shaft that goes up to the column. Now, this is fairly accessible. You're seeing me at the front going over the driver's side inner CV shaft. I've got an extension hooked up to a 10 millimeter swivel. And again, very easily accessible, was able to put an impact on that to zip it off. Now this might be rusted on, but it also, again, accessible with an air hammer with the chisel type on the end, going right into this little line right here, just a couple of blasts, and this pushed right off. So you're going to want the steering gear movable as you lower down the subframe. So it's a good idea to get those bolts out of the subframe before we go further. Now, there's a bolt on each side of the steering gear. This is one of the bolts that actually comes up underneath the subframe and goes into the steering gear. Keep in mind an aluminum housing, so they're pretty tight. Most impacts will struggle to get this loose. So you'll notice I used a breaker bar and carefully turned until they both came loose, and then I was able to zip them out with an impact. Now, before we start thinking about removing the back bolts and lowering it down, you need to get your jack. If you're on the ground, notice how I've got my jack positioned right in the center of the subframe, making sure it can stay in a good spot where it's not going to slip loose. If you're up in the air, this is where you'd want to put your tranny jack. So once we zip the bolts out for the rear, we can slowly start lowering down the subframe. Now that you got your subframe supported, we'll go ahead and remove these two bolts out of each of the rear subframe mounts. There's two on each side. Zip those out, and then zip this bolt out, and this whole piece will come down on each side, and we'll be ready to begin lowering the subframe. Now, as you're lowering the subframe, you're going to notice that this stabilizer bar is kind of in your way. So what some guys have done is they'll loosen these two bolts on each side of the subframe for the stabilizer bar and rotate this up. And yes, that does give you clearance. I'm going to tell you, as long as you loosen both of these bolts anyway, it's only a few more seconds of time to zip them completely out. I found it much easier once I just went ahead and zipped both the bolts out. Then I could get the stabilizer bar completely out of my way. And as you'll see in a moment, at that point, we can lower the subframe down, and you'll be able to rotate your steering gear very easily to get at the connectors that we need to unplug and pop loose. Now, I want you to notice, with the subframe out of the way, you do have a steel bracket that's held in by a couple of bolts. This bolt right here holds a kind of like a cloth shield over the connectors. So when you remove this bolt, you'll be able to tip that shield back. I'll show you that more in a moment. You'll be able to get this bolt out, the ground cable released, which has to be released. Again, with the stabilizer bar removed, you'll be able to rotate this to work on the stuff you need to work on, make it easier to get this rack out. Now rotate the steering gear and move this cloth shield out of the way. Just tuck it out of the way so that you can get at the connectors like you see here. We're going to need to get those unplugged to remove the gear. Now, the only connectors that we have to unplug are this one and this one. This one is going to come with the new or used rack that you're installing. This one here, there is a push pin right on the other side. You can tilt it a little bit to get to it. Just a little push pin. You can either use a pick or your finger. Push it in till you feel it click, pull it straight out. That one's simple enough to unplug. This one is not difficult either, and it's why it's nice to have it rotated to see. If you don't pull this red block back, take a pick or your finger, push it back, then push on this pin, it'll unlock the tab and allow you to unplug that connector. Now remember, these two connectors, this one and this one, they're part of this harness, and so is this ground. Don't forget to get this ground unbolted, because otherwise, as you pull the rack down, you could wreck the ground cable. Now, a very important note, before you completely remove this rack. Now that you got the connectors easily to unplug and plug back in, remember the new rack or used rack has to be programmed. And the best way to program this rack, especially if you're going used, is to take the old information out of the old one and put it in a new one. So now is the time to plug this original rack back in before you remove it, turn your key on, do the programming, and when it tells you to install the new module, you can easily unplug this, install the new one, and program it. And if you need assistance programming it, note there is a programming video attached to this to walk you through that procedure. But it is super important to do that programming at this point before going further. One more tip on this, now that you'll be able to easily slide that gear out of there with things out of the way, before you put your new one up in there, even if it's brand new, but especially if it's used, inspect the used one closely. Make sure the salvage yard that got it didn't damage this harness. This isn't snapped or cracked, because if any damage got done to this sensor or its harness that works its way back and plugs in, you're going to get this all plugged in and you're going to get steering wheel sensor codes. And then the whole thing has to come apart. This sensor in itself is not replaceable, so it's part of the gear. The other thing, this is the power steering motor and the module. This is the actual power steering module itself. Look this over closely. Make sure they didn't bend pins over, that it's not cracked, because once again, this is, once it's up in there, if you have issues with it, start setting codes while you're driving, the last thing you want to do is have to pull the whole thing apart again. So make sure what they sent you is in good condition and not damaged. And once that's all done and the programming's done, you can reassemble in the exact opposite order that we've talked about in the disassembly.